Welcome. My name is Sasha Moore, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's Legal Update, an initiative from Unisearch, Australia's leading and most established provider of expert opinion services. This program has been created to provide bite-sized updates on various matter areas to help the legal profession stay informed about topical developments, legislative updates, and changes in the respective fields. Today's session is going to focus on the increasingly topical area of electronics, and in particularly the battery sector, which is rapidly evolving. From exploding batteries to non-compliant imports, Australian lawyers are increasingly navigating complex questions of safety, accountability, and cross-border liability. This webinar unpacks the legal frameworks, the key players, and the emerging case trends shaping product liability in today's tech-driven world. So with us here today, we have one of Unisearch's esteemed expert witnesses, Professor Niraj Sharma, who specialises in battery properties. In this session, Professor Sharma will provide us with an overview of key policy developments, including the evolution of the battery sector, regulatory and safety variances, including quality control changes. He'll also go through who's accountable for an incident. Is that the manufacturer, the supplier or retailer, as well as emerging case trends? Welcome, Professor Sharma.
Hello, and it's great to be here.
And I love that you're kitted up in lab, and we were just talking offline that I am insanely jealous that you just get to blow things up as part of your job. So we're really looking forward to getting your insights.
Fantastic.
And we also have with us Christopher Aaron-Yong, who is a BDM at Unisearch, who will provide some legal overlays of some legal context to Professor Sharma's comments. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Sasha.
So let's kick off. So Niraj, I am going to put you in the hot seat, so to speak, and let's start with a very broad overview of the evolution of the battery sector and how that's really moved us forward to where we are today.
Sure. So if we sort of take back 30, 40 years ago, the batteries that we were dealing with were lead acid batteries. When you start your car, it would be the starter battery. And then we also had alkali batteries you'd use for kids' toys and things like this. But really, in the last 20 to 30 years, what we've seen is a massive increase in lithium-ion batteries. And these are ubiquitous in society. So you have them in everything from personal electronics, so your mobile phones, all the way to grid-scale storage, right? And so they come in various shapes and sizes. So this is a lithium-ion battery that you might find in your power tools or in your portable vacuum cleaner or electronics at home. So it's called an 18650. So it's 18 millimeters wide and 65 millimeters tall. You could have about 2,000 of those in an electric vehicle. Alternatively, electric vehicles can have blade batteries, so different formats. This is a big battery. It's not an electric vehicle, but you can sort of see it's a battery that you'd use in, say, storage solutions for your home, right? A company in Victoria is putting about 900 of these lithium-ion batteries on power poles. So they are found now in a whole range of areas, from the household all the way to the commercial sector, so the larger scale sector. And the question then becomes, are they safe? How do they work? And what's the important details that we need to sort of tease into to see how they work into the legal framework and the regulatory framework?
Thank you. And it is extraordinary, both the reliance on battery as well as the different types of batteries. And I know that when we were sort of speaking offline, we're talking about manufacturing shifting offshore and into often multiple jurisdictions, which makes the quality control process much more difficult to track. And we'll get into the accountability piece a bit later on. But those increased reliance on third-party suppliers compounded by being offshore. Chris, I'll lean into you in a second, but we're already sort of starting to see the case where literally we've got a dramatic increase of the use of batteries, but that's coinciding with less and less quality control frameworks, which are able to be quantified. So also with shorter product life cycles and faster market entry, meaning less time for testing, we're starting to lay a framework of increased exposure. So Chris, to that point, from a legal perspective, what are your observations about this rise of use as well as the decentralization of quality control, particularly in multiple jurisdictions?
Thanks, Sasha, and thank you, Niraj, for the update. Just to build on that, we are seeing that surge in low-cost electronics, and of course, the lithium-ion batteries that power these electronics really flood the market. And the cause of this is the digital marketplace. Now, in research from Energy Safe Victoria, which was published just a week ago, it indicated that around 64% of 18 to 29-year-old riders of e-scooters, e-bikes, e-skateboards are buying generic batteries and generic chargers online. Now, as you mentioned, Sasha, with quality control under the spotlight, we're finding that regulators are trying to really reiterate to consumers of the dangers of these short-term generic batteries and then opening themselves up to the risks of fires, fatalities, or major injuries down the line.
No, indeed. And I think it's a nice way to then sort of segue into the regulatory and safety frameworks. So Niraj, can you give us a recap of where the Australian standards currently are and what some of the challenges are in the current landscape of accountability?
So I guess there's one other thing that is quite important. A battery, a lithium-ion battery, isn't just one component. It's about 20 components that make up a single cell, right? So in terms of sort of tracking where the issues are, you can sort of see that you have the suppliers, the manufacturers of the cells themselves, and then the people who sell the products, right? So when we start talking about in terms of regulations, you can sort of there's a really nice sort of way I like to think about this is you've got electric vehicles which are quite heavily regulated. There's a safety of the occupant, right? You have ANCAP testing, so you have all these peripheral things that test the safety of the vehicle. And because the battery is the biggest part or the most expensive part and the heaviest part, that part as well. So there's quite a lot of regulations and structures around that. When you have grid scale storage, big storage systems, again, highly expensive things. Again, a lot of regulation around that. Also, they're further away. So they're away from sort of population centers. So you have, a little bit of a margin there. And then you have household batteries as well. So you have those ones that are against doors or sometimes inside. Again, there's a bit of regulation around there. Fire services, New South Wales, for example, are aware of where all the household batteries are. So there are, certain regulations that have to be met at certain specifications and certain temperature conditions. So you need to have your household battery undercover, for example, if it's outside. So there's a lot of information and a lot of regulation around those bigger batteries. When you get down to the smaller batteries, say the ones that are medical devices, again, quite a lot of regulation, quite a lot of testing, quite a lot of understanding of how they interact with the body. So you can't, after 10 years, you have to replace them and things like this. And then you have the portable electronics, laptops, mobile phones. Again, they're on people, they're in your pockets, right? Again, quite a fair bit of regulations around that to sort of say, well, these are the specs. And again, the manufacturers are quite interested in making sure that you have a safe mobile phone or your mobile phone doesn't last there. The other thing there is those devices are single cell, so one lithium-ion battery, right? A big electric car is 2,000. Then you have this little region, it's quite a large region from, say, household electronics all the way to scooters and electric cycles. And that region there, I feel, is the least regulated and the hardest to regulate because people can buy their batteries offline. And as Chris mentioned, it's easier to get these and easier to substitute these and easier to buy non-branded. Yeah, non-branded, that's the one. Non-branded technology. So when you sort of look at the spectrum, you have the large, you have the small, and it's this middle section, which have quite energy dense batteries, which can lead to severe consequences that are not really well regulated, and that regulators are finding it hard to sort of come up with appropriate conditions for that.
Well, thanks for that explanation. And I do want to focus on this latter section because this is from a legal framework, to me, the most obvious level of exposure points where you've got as we were saying before, an increase in category. So increase in that bandwidth, but also an increase in generic products within that bandwidth.
Yes.
So Chris, from a legal perspective, what's your take or what's your assessment of the state of regulation and in particular how it relates to the exposure point of these unbranded sources?
Well, our observations are very similar, well, from the market perspective to what Niraj was saying. So that middle band, we're seeing a lot of state-based regulators start to increase their focus on building up frameworks to support consumers within that middle band space. So if you think about it, just 3 months ago, on the 1st of February this year, New South Wales Fair Trading introduced prescribed safety standards for these high-demand lithium-ion battery-powered devices. Now, these are focused on micro-mobility devices, as I talked about before, e-scooters, e-bikes, one-wheel devices, to name a few, and then the batteries themselves that power them. Now, what this change means essentially is that they're declared electrical articles, which means that they have to comply with prescribed safety standards. And this is one of the first key tranches in a number of dates which New South Wales Fair Trading is releasing, which include mandatory testing and certification in August this year, and then enforcement of mandatory labeling in February next year.
Okay, great, thank you. And it is good to see that measures are being taken, but again, from a legal framework, whilst that's good for the future, there are massive exposure points and risk points right now. So let's talk through the complexity of who is accountable just on a scenario-based environment, because I was thinking in a real day, what this looks like today, what this looks like in terms of a matter that could come across a litigator's desk today is there's a scenario where a lithium-ion battery explodes in a consumer's home. So who is responsible? And Niraj, I'm going to throw to you because there are a few broad areas right now. So there is the manufacturer, the supplier, importer, or the retailer. So can you talk through the complexities of who would then be deemed as responsible for that fire or for that incident or for that fatality?
So look, this is a little bit out of my area of expertise, so I might have to pass over to Chris.
Yeah.
But in terms of the batteries themselves, I think it's worthwhile. You sort of got a really nice point there that the legacy. There's batteries in the field. There's legacy. So how do you actually, reactively, if the policy comes in now, it's going to be reactive to the batteries that are already in the field.
And actually, Niraj, I might just pause because you raised a really good point. So to be clear, my question comes from identifying the battery component, and whether, so not from a legal perspective, but more a traceability perspective or the origin of that battery malfunction. So if I rephrase it from that perspective, let's maybe start at the top.
So let's, if we sort of think about the high quality branded batteries that are from reputable manufacturers, when we think about a battery, it's a chemical system, and over time it degrades, right? It just gets used, it degrades, right? And typically there's a lifetime associated with it. Say, for example, mobile electronics, 2 years, 80% degradation. So things change, things evolve, right? And when you start thinking about quality control, I've heard from various cell manufacturers, right? So these are people who make the cells, that they're getting errors of 1 in a billion cells, right? So really a small, very small number, comparable to sort of medical procedures in a sense. And those errors, those sort of things, cells that don't work, most of them just simply don't work, right? They don't explode, right? And I guess that's the crux. But there are ones that will explode, either as manufactured or under use, right? And often they have a defect in them, and you can sort of see it only needs to be a micrometer or a millimeter, and all of a sudden you have a situation where you're overcharging one proportion of the battery, it gets really hot, and then the whole thing, and well, the electrolyte boils, and there's a pathway, the propagation pathway, which I can talk about for days on end with you if you want at a later date. But in a sense, there is mechanisms for the batteries to explode. Now, one of the great things that manufacturers do is if they identify, there's various ways to identify this, and you sort of look at the numbers, and it's a very small proportion that will explode, right? If they're used properly. Now, if they're abused or if there's conditions that are outside the operating conditions, then that also becomes problematic. So from a legal point of view, in terms of all the 20 materials that make up the cell, it really is the cell manufacturer that puts it together that is your first stop, right? That who puts it together, who constructs it, who fills the electrolyte, who makes the device, right? And often the reason why you don't go back to the other components is because this process here is actually quite complicated, right? It is probably the most complex process in making a battery, is making these cells, winding them up. And often they need to be formed and pre-cycled before you actually buy it in a device or before it goes into a device. The second part is the people who make devices, right? Or the companies that make devices. And then the third part is where you buy it from. And so you've got all those three other, I guess, the key places: the cell manufacturers, the device manufacturers, so the device being, say, the portable power tool or the portable vacuum or the electric vehicle. And then you have the person who sells it to you, the retailer, right? And so you might find that one battery manufacturer, cell manufacturer, supplies multiple sort of device manufacturers, so electric vehicles, for example. And so it does become, where do you do that? The cell manufacturer will have their standard operating conditions. The device manufacturer will have their own operating conditions. And so if you're using those batteries within those operating conditions, you should be fine, right? In principle, you should be fine and be covered, right? However, the question is, does everyone use it under these conditions, right? Do you have a day when you have you're in a tin roof and you've parked your car, for example, and it gets hot, or you've put your vacuum cleaner outside and it gets hot, above 60 degrees Celsius, for example, right? How does that work, and who's responsible then? And I think that's where Chris could sort of talk more about it. But there's the use and how you use it. Now, if you use it and it's above those limits, there should be management systems in some of the more advanced systems. So, for example, in a genuine product, you probably have so you have the battery and the cell. You also have a management system which is linked to the cell. And so if there's a temperature monitor, if it gets too high, it basically kills the battery, or it gives you a sign. So there are ways manufacturers and suppliers and instrument and device manufacturers have actually thought of these procedures, right? Thought of these considerations. And so, when we start thinking about how can it explode, why does it explode, is the battery fire, right? We have to discount all of these other, or account for, I should say, these other foundations or frameworks, and then sort of get to the idea of whether the battery caused the fire in the first place. And that's quite important, right? That identification step is quite important. And I guess, does that answer your question? Does that give you a bit of a perspective?
As you were speaking, my mind was just swirling because it's so tremendously complex as well as diverse. So I guess from your perspective as an expert witness, I would expect that that's where a legal firm would reach out to you to establish that root cause.
Yes.
Prior to then the matter. And I would expect from that perspective, and Chris, I might throw to you, are you finding that experts in such matters are being involved earlier in cases?
Yeah, definitely. So as we pointed out in an earlier recording that we did with Konstantin Moskianis, which is a construction and architecture expert, we're finding that firms are reaching out sooner rather than later, and seeking that technical expertise across different areas in order to really strengthen their case and get a better understanding of the matter.
Indeed. Well, Niraj, I might throw to you because obviously we've set the scene and there are a lot of gaps. and in particular emerging case trends and what you anticipate, not from again a legal perspective, but what you anticipate a rise in from a battery perspective. And as we were saying, this compounded environment of the usage in that sector increasing, as well as the volume of unbranded options or generic options simultaneously also increasing.
Look, that's a big question. It's different ways to look at it, but really, I think as we're sort of progressing, there's so many batteries out there, and it's very easy to blame the battery. I think that's one of the things that we have to be very careful of. As an expert, this is one thing that I'm very careful about. Is it the battery? Can I actually identify something that is related to actually the battery, or is it other parts like the electronics that control it, the power? And that's why it's good to actually have more than just the battery expert. I can tell you whether it's the battery, or I can give you indications on whether it is the battery or that side of things. But having that broader sort of experts to come in and sort of really give you that frame, that holistic picture is quite important. Now, in terms of where I sort of see the risk, I guess, for consumers is actually that, again, as I said, that sector, that middle sector, because it is actually very usable. It's near your house. It's often very close to where you're using it. And also what we're seeing, though, is the type of chemistry inside the battery. So we're seeing the larger batteries going to safer chemistries. So this is called lithium iron phosphate chemistry, for example, that tend to be a little bit safer. And there's lithium iron phosphate, lithium titanate, which is actually, relatively safe, as in they're less likely to explode. And if they do explode, there's less consequences. Whereas the small portable electronics, they're small, you still need a lot of energy. And therefore the chemistries we use for the components that go inside it are actually quite energetic. And so when they explode, there's much more of a sort of impact of that, right? So I see that balance. And I think in terms of industry trends, we might actually be seeing that the safety argument there is actually changing. So people are using safer batteries in that space as well. But so balance between cost, safety, and performance, right? You don't want your power tool to last 1 hour and then you're on top of a building and you're like, so there's that balance that needs to be done. And then maybe even the consumer, you might be thinking about what's your best solution for you as well. But then also we're seeing a transition in terms of the research, and this is what I do, from lithium ion batteries to other chemistries and other technologies. So sodium ion batteries are considered safer. I think it's still debatable whether it is safer or not, because we've done some tests and I'm not convinced yet. But there's technology that is coming out. So instead of lithium ion, sodium ion batteries, the energy density is lower, but is it a safer system? Well, safer to transport as well, at least.
So I might just interject there in terms of that safety piece, because I think it's what it comes down to. And as you say, the usability and the safety. And we were really, the three of us were just talking offline, and sort of the what I immediately saw from a legal perspective is the consequence. So what does this mean for a lawyer being presented with a matter? And we talked about the increase of fires in potentially faulty batteries, and particularly in e-bikes and power banks and those types of things. We're also talking about the injuries from personal mobility devices such as e-scooters and so forth if there is a malfunction, as well as smart home failures. So whether that again results in personal injury or other. Chris, I might throw to you just to unpack more of sort of the legal or the legal angles that you see potentially being on the rise as a consequence of these emerging trends.
Thanks, Sasha. And definitely, it's just to clarify, it's a legal market update. None of this is legal advice. And just to build on Niraj's kind of whole trifecta, cost, safety, and performance, what we're noticing in the legal market is that regulators are focusing much more on the safety component. And a lot of that comes off the back of last year's record number of reported incidents in New South Wales, which sat at 275 reported incidents. You also see, from a regulator perspective, the ACCC taking action against a lot of large Australian retailers, one of which was had a claim against them for 70 product lines, which contained batteries, little button batteries, which didn't comply with Australian standards. And that was over a period of 2 years. But in addition to that, they were also on, there you go, button battery. They're also on the hook for selling over 57,000 of those little button batteries. So we're also seeing a rise in this class action space. And Sasha, we talked about this earlier before, a lot of experts are being engaged across different industries and fields in order to kind of bolster the case. So as Niraj, you mentioned, you might be the focus for batteries, but there might be other components that contributed to the failure. But in short, in the legal market, you're really seeing the market realize that there's a risk to life as well as a risk to industry and infrastructure. And we're seeing government agencies and firms and professionals react as such.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, this has been a tremendously interesting and insightful conversation. And really the insights that I've taken is that there is, whilst there is an increase of compliance, an increase in focus of compliance, it's still a very exposed area and it's a very complex area. So I'd echo your sentiment, Chris, that, you know, understanding the risks and understanding that there are so many components to assess that risk. And as Niraj, you said, like, you know, don't just assume the battery. It's not necessarily the poor battery's fault, but it could be the battery's fault. So my suggestion would be to any battery related matter to really assess the matter with experts. And as Niraj was saying, whether it's the battery and or other from the outset, to really have a full and educated, well-gauged assessment of the situation. Niraj, so wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for your insights.